Texas, December 1944. The war was still devouring Europe, and the blood of American sons soaked frozen fields across the Ardennes. But here, under a sky that burned too blue, a strange silence hung over the barbed wire fences of a prisoner of war camp in the heart of Texas. Not filled with men, but with German women clerks, nurses, telephone operators, enemy hands by allegiance, not by rifle. That Christmas, something happened that confounded both sides of the wire. The victors fed the enemy, and not scraps of feast, the kind their own dead would never taste. The road to the camp shimmered with heat, even in winter. Dust clung to the boots of the MPs, escorting the new arrivals, a line of tired, sunburnt women stepping off the back of a military truck. Some clutched threadbare satchels, others wrapped their arms across their chests like armor. Most had not seen home in years. Captured in North Africa and Italy, they were processed like livestock, labeled, photographed, and relocated to this forgotten corner of Texas Camp Hearn. Barbed wire stretched in long, cruel lines against the horizon, and guard towers loomed like unmoving sentinels. The air smelled of sand, diesel, and something else, the sour anxiety of not knowing what comes next. The American guards, mostly young men from the South, stood stiff but confused. They'd been briefed to expect dangerous prisoners. Propaganda back home told them Germans were beasts, ideologues, monsters in skirts. But these women looked ordinary. One held a rosary. Another limped from an untreated wound. They didn't speak unless spoken to. No salutes, no shouts of Heil, just silence. Inside the camp, the buildings were bare and functional low wooden barracks, a mess hall, latrines, and a chapel that no one used. The commander, a gray-haired veteran of the Great War, watched the newcomers from a shaded porch, a cigarette burning down between his fingers. He remembered the last war's prisoners, half-starved Frenchmen coughing blood behind wire fences in Bavaria. This was different. These women were not soldiers. They had carried files, not rifles. But still, they had worn the eagle. And that meant something. That meant they were still the enemy. As the gates clanged shut behind them, one of the women turned and stared at the open sky. No planes, no smoke, no guns, just silence, and Sunday she did not smile. Not yet. The sun in Texas did not strike like the one back home. It didn't shimmer, it punished. It poured down like molten glass, filling the camp with a dry, blinding stillness. The German women learned quickly to keep to the shadows, to wrap damp cloths around their necks, to walk slowly or not at all. Each morning began with the same ritual, a whistle, a roll call, a silent march to breakfast. The food was strange, soft bread, watery eggs, thin coffee with no bitterness. It was better than what many of them had eaten in weeks. But none dared say it out loud. In their minds, they still braced for cruelty. They remembered what had been told to them in the Reich, how the Americans humiliated prisoners, shaved heads, starved women, forced them into labor camps where dignity died. And yet, no such punishment came. They were given soap, blankets, access to medical care. The guards, though armed and firm, addressed them with polite disinterest. Ma'am and miss carried across the yards in southern drawls. It was not kindness, but it was not hate either. That alone confused the women more than violence would have. Their thoughts turned inward. They avoided eye contact with the guards, and more often, with each other. Some women carved days into the wooden posts of their bunks. Others sat for hours, staring at the fence, not looking at it, but through it as if the wire were a veil, and beyond it their old lives waited. One of them, Marta, a former telephone operator from Stuttgart, found herself assigned to laundry duty. She'd expected gruel and punishment, but instead was handed a bucket and told simply, "Keep it clean." Another woman, Greta, asked to see a chaplain. She was granted the request without question. In the quiet corners of the camp, a strange tension began to grow. It was not the threat of violence, it was the absence of it. The silence became unsettling. One night, a woman named Lotte whispered, "They're softening us up." The others nodded, half believing it, half hoping it. For what purpose? None could say. Rumors spread like fire in the dry air. Some thought they would be repatriated. Others said they were being kept for propaganda. But the most persistent rumor was about Christmas. It was spoken in hushed tones, always with suspicion, that the Americans would offer them a special meal. Turkey, someone said. Pie, said another. It was too absurd to entertain seriously. War was still raging. Boys were still dying. No one gave sugar to the enemy. No one shared butter with those who wore the eagle. But as the days passed and the guards began humming carols under their breath, doubt crept in. It wasn't what was done that unsettled the women. It was what wasn't done. And that, more than cruelty, began to feel like a kind of war all its own. The order came down, folded in triplicate, sealed with the War Department's stamp, carried by a courier with dust on his boots and impatience in his voice. It was not a request, it was a directive. All prisoner of war camps shall observe the Christmas holiday by issuing a special meal to detainees in accordance with Geneva provisions. The camp commander, Colonel Walter Harrington, read the words 3 times before setting the paper down beside his untouched coffee. Outside his window, a group of German women were sweeping the yard in silence, their movements slow and mechanical, like ghosts in uniform. Harrington was not a sentimental man. He had fought in the trenches of the Somme, had watched friends die with mud in their mouths, and had never fully trusted peace since. Yet he followed rules. That was what made America different. He believed order, structure, decency, even in war. Still, the timing felt cruel. News had just reached the camp of a fresh German offensive in Europe. The newspapers called it a surprise attack, the Ardennes. American boys were dying by the hundreds in forests filled with snow and blood. Parents were receiving telegrams that would ruin their holidays forever. And now, this? Feed their captives a feast? Harrington called a meeting with the mess sergeant, the quartermaster, and the head cook, a wiry man from Kansas named Doyle. When he told them the order, the room fell into a heavy silence. Doyle was the first to speak. "Sir, my brother's in Bastogne right now, eating out of a can, and you want me to serve pie to the people who put him there?" Harrington didn't answer. He didn't need to. The paper spoke for itself. The quartermaster shook his head. Supplies were low. Butter was rationed. Sugar was tight. And oranges? They'd have to call in favors from town just to find a crate. It wasn't just logistics. It was principle. The guards had grown used to seeing the enemy behind fences, but feeding them felt like erasing the line. Harrington finally spoke, his voice low and cold. "It's not for them. It's for us. We do this because we're Americans. We don't let war decide who we are." No one argued after that. Orders were orders. But something shifted in the room, resentment, unspoken but heavy, like dust before a storm. Preparations began the next morning. Doyle sharpened knives with a clenched jaw. Kitchen staff moved with grim focus, carving turkeys and peeling potatoes like it was penance. The guards kept their distance. Some muttered under their breath. Others stared too long through the mess hall windows, imagining their brothers in foxholes while the enemy dined in warmth. The war was far away, but in that kitchen, a quiet battle had begun. One not of guns or grenades, but of dignity, pride, and the unbearable weight of doing the right thing for the wrong people. The kitchen, once filled with the dull rhythm of routine meals, now pulsed with silent rebellion. The moment the holiday menu was posted, roast turkey, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans cooked in bacon fat, fresh rolls with butter, cranberry sauce, and apple pie, a wave of disbelief swept through the staff. Doyle, the head cook, stared at the list as if it had been written in a foreign tongue. He read it once, then again, then folded it slowly and walked out. No one stopped him. That night, he didn't return. The next morning, he came back with bloodshot eyes and a bottle-shaped bulge under his coat, which no one dared question. "Let's get this over with," was all he said. The other cooks followed suit, not out of agreement, but because disobedience would do nothing but invite punishment. Still, the mood turned sour. Even the pots clanged with resentment. "They're feeding better than we are," muttered one young corporal, peeling potatoes with unnecessary violence. "Better than our boys out there in the mud." In the dry storehouse, a shipment of oranges arrived, ripe, bright, golden like captured suns. No one touched them. The guards who helped unload the crates did so in silence, like they were carrying the wrong kind of ammunition. One of them, a private from Alabama, kicked a box over when no one was looking. The fruit spilled across the floor like shame. Rumors spread quickly, as they always did in closed places. Some believed it was a test that the prisoners would be paraded and photographed, the feast staged for some wartime propaganda. Others swore that a senator's wife had intervened, demanding that American decency be shown even to Nazi women. The truth didn't matter. The grumbling deepened. Even the chaplain found himself cornered by a furious sergeant, whose twin brother had just been listed as missing in action. "Tell me, Reverend," the sergeant spat, "how many pies they get for killing him?" The chaplain said nothing. He just looked at the floor and quietly walked away. In the background, the war raged on. Updates came daily: frozen corpses in the Ardennes, tanks swallowed by snow, desperate letters from the front line. And yet, here in the middle of Texas, ovens were fired up for the enemy. Doyle finally broke when a shipment of cream arrived. He slammed the pail onto the counter and shouted, "We're making whipped cream now. For them?" His voice echoed across the kitchen. No one replied. In the silence that followed, the sound of spoons scraping bowls and knives against wood returned. The men cooked, but not for forgiveness, not for peace. They cooked because they were told to, and that, perhaps, was the most American thing they could do. The night before Christmas fell heavy and strange inside the wire. A cold front had crept in from the north, and though the Texas air never truly froze, it bit at the skin just enough to stir memories of home. In the women's barracks, silence hung like fog. No one sang, no one spoke louder than a whisper. The bunks were lined with figures curled under coarse blankets, some holding photographs, others clutching nothing at all. The room smelled of soap and old wood and something else, an aching grief that had no name. In the far corner, Lotte braided string into a loop, trying to shape it into a star. She had been a nurse once, had sewn flesh and held dying hands. Now she sewed silence. Marta, the former telephone operator, sat cross-legged on the floor, her back against the wall. She ran her fingers over the edge of a crumpled Red Cross letter, lips moving in a silent prayer, though she had not believed in years. Near the door, Greta whispered the first lines of Stille Nacht, but no one joined in. Even that hymn felt dangerous now, too beautiful for this place. They had heard rumors, wild ones, turkey, oranges, pie, a feast. They didn't believe them, not truly. To believe was to hope, and hope was far more dangerous than hunger. The guards had acted different, yes. They had been quieter, less stern. One had even said, "Merry Christmas," through the fence that morning. But kindness had always come with a cost, and so the women waited, not for gifts, but for the moment the pretense dropped and punishment returned. At exactly 8, the door opened. A young American lieutenant stepped in. He was nervous, barely older than some of them. His voice cracked when he spoke. "You're to come to the mess hall, one group at a time. Please line up." The women exchanged glances. Some stood slowly, others hesitated. Was this a trick? A test? Lotte clutched her star tighter. Marta folded her letter and hid it in her shoe. They moved in silence, single file, their breath visible in the night air. The camp was strangely still. No dogs barking, no shouted orders. Just the sound of boots crunching on dry ground. When they reached the mess hall, the doors swung open, and a wave of warmth hit them, real warmth, from ovens and lamps and food. Rows of tables had been set. Plates waited. Steam rose from trays of meat and bowls of potatoes. The air smelled of cinnamon, fat, and sugar. Some women gasped. One staggered backward, another wept and quickly turned her face away. No guards pointed rifles. No one barked orders. It was not a trick. It was a meal. For them. And in that moment, no one knew what to do. They stepped inside like pilgrims entering a cathedral, unsure if they were welcome or being judged. The mess hall glowed with an amber light, warm against the cool breath of the night behind them. It smelled of roasted meat and baked bread, and something else they had not felt in years: safety. Long tables stretched down the room, covered in white paper tablecloths weighed down with chipped metal plates and shining utensils. Each place was already filled. A thick slice of roast turkey glistened in its own juices. There were mashed potatoes, buttery and steaming, and rolls split open beside pads of real butter, soft, golden, melting. A whole orange sat on every tray like a symbol, bright and absurd, the kind of fruit they had only seen in paintings as children. And then there was the pie. Apple, crust flaking, still warm. Some of the women couldn't move. One stood frozen in the doorway until a guard gently nodded for her to go forward. Another covered her mouth with her hands and quietly sobbed. No one laughed, no one mocked. There was no music, no speeches, no ceremony, just the clink of chairs being pulled back and the soft shuffle of footsteps across a wooden floor. Marta sat first, then Lotte, then others. They did not speak at first, they simply looked. Some bowed their heads, not in prayer but disbelief. One woman whispered, "Is this for us?" as if naming it might break the spell. Greta reached for the butter with trembling fingers, spreading it over the warm bread like it was a relic. She hadn't tasted butter in nearly 3 years. When she bit into it, her eyes filled. Across the table, another woman refused to eat. She stared at the plate like it was a test she would fail by giving in. But hunger and the smell of apples and cinnamon wore her down. She picked up the fork and brought it to her mouth. Her lips quivered before they opened. Even the guards, posted along the walls, seemed changed. They no longer stared with suspicion. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others stood stiff, as if unsure whether to feel pride or guilt. A few held back smiles that never reached their eyes. They were watching something they had never been trained to understand: mercy. No orders could explain it. The youngest prisoner, a girl who had just turned 16 in captivity, asked if she could say grace. She did so in German. No one stopped her. Her voice was soft and steady as she gave thanks not for victory, not for freedom, but simply for the food before them. And still, no one said a word. The entire hall had become a church, and for a few sacred minutes, no one remembered who the enemy was. The girl's prayer lingered in the air long after her voice had quieted, like smoke from an invisible candle. She had spoken with her eyes closed, hands folded in her lap, unaware that every sound in the room had ceased to exist but her own words. Even those who did not believe, who had cursed God or turned from him during the long years of hunger and fear, kept their heads bowed. When she finished, there was no applause, just the sound of metal scraping against plates and the hesitant beginning of eating. Slowly, reverently, the women began to taste, not devour taste. Each bite was a discovery, each flavor a memory of a world that had once made sense. The turkey reminded one woman of her wedding dinner. The cranberry sauce brought another back to her childhood kitchen, where her mother had tried an American recipe from a borrowed cookbook. The orange, just holding it, was enough to undo them. Marta peeled hers with shaking fingers, the citrus oil spraying into the air, sharp and clean and alive. She stared at the segments like they were precious stones before putting one on her tongue and closing her eyes. Lottie didn't eat right away. She took the small paper napkin and smoothed it with care, then folded it once, then again, tucking it into her pocket as if it were a relic. "Proof," she whispered, "that it happened." Beside her, Greta broke the silence. "They don't hate us." Her voice was hollow, as though she didn't believe her own words. Another woman, older, replied without looking up. "They do, but maybe not all of them." Around the room, quiet conversations began, not in anger or fear, but confusion. Some still looked toward the guards, waiting for the catch, the punishment, the lecture, the reveal that this was all a trap. But the guards simply stood, unmoving, unsure of what they were witnessing. They had been told these women were dangerous, had been shown photographs of concentration camps, warned of fanatics who would die for Hitler, who would kill without hesitation. But what they saw now were not monsters, just women, thin, weary, grateful women wiping tears from their cheeks while sipping weak coffee and chewing pie like it was the most sacred thing they'd ever tasted. One guard, barely older than 20, leaned against the far wall and muttered to the corporal beside him, "My mom would have done the same." The corporal didn't answer. He was staring at a woman who reminded him of his sister. For the first time since the war began, the line between enemy and human blurred. It didn't vanish, but it softened, like ice warming in the Sunday. And that frightened everyone, guards and prisoners alike. Because if your enemy is not evil, then what does that make the war? And worse, what does it make you? That night, after the plates were cleared and the doors to the mess hall were quietly shut, the women returned to their barracks in silence. Not the silence of fear or suspicion, but something else. something that settled in the chest like an ache too gentle to be called pain. Once inside, the energy changed. They did not sleep, not yet. Some sat on their bunks, holding their oranges, unopened, unwilling to waste them on hunger. Others lit scraps of candle, ends, and placed them on metal tin lids, creating little halos of light. A kind of ceremony emerged unspoken, unplanned. It wasn't joy that filled the room. It was memory. And in that space, something stirred that hadn't been felt in years. The desire to tell someone, to write it down before it vanished. Marta pulled out the stub of a pencil she had hidden in her boot, then tore a corner from the lining of her coat. She wrote slowly, carefully, in tight German script. They gave us turkey. They gave us pie. There was warmth. There was no hatred. I do not understand it. Greta borrowed a Red Cross form and used the back. An orange, she wrote. I peeled it with my fingers. It smelled like Christmas when I was a child. The guard nodded when I looked up. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away. Lotte was more cautious. She folded the napkin she'd stolen from the mess hall and placed it inside the hollowed spine of her prayer book. I will show them, she whispered. Someday, someone must see this. Not all dared to write. Some stared at the wall, hollowed out by the contradiction. One woman muttered that it was propaganda, a trick to ease their minds before worse things came. Another shook her head. No, she said. The trick was that they did it and meant nothing by it. That is what makes it unbearable. A few tried to smuggle the scraps out. The Red Cross volunteers, who came weekly to deliver packages and check conditions, were the only possible route. Marta slipped her note into the seam of her sock. Greta tucked hers beneath the flap of a care box she hoped would be inspected with less scrutiny. But most of those messages never made it past the censors. The American staff, following protocol, destroyed anything not written on approved forms. The German inspectors, upon receiving unauthorized scraps, burned them out of fear they might spread dangerous ideas. Kindness, after all, was harder to control than cruelty. It disrupted the neat machinery of hate. In the end, only a few fragments survived, tucked deep in seams, hidden in shoes, remembered in silence. But those who lived it did not forget. They could not. The war would rage on. Death would continue to pour from the sky and from rifles. But for one night, in one forgotten corner of the world, the enemy had been fed, and in return, they carried that memory like a secret weapon no one could confiscate. The morning after the feast, the camp looked the same fences, the same towers, the same guards, with rifles slung over their shoulders, like routine. But something in the air had shifted, like dust settling after a long storm. The women still lined up for roll call, still marched in silence, still kept their eyes lowered. Yet their movements had softened, less mechanical. A few even met the gaze of the guards, not out of defiance, out of recognition. In the kitchen, Doyle returned to his usual routine with a grunt and a cigarette hanging from his mouth. He didn't mention the feast. He didn't have to. The pie tins were already cleaned, the turkey bones boiled down for stock. But when a German woman assigned to laundry came in asking for extra soap, Doyle handed it over without grumbling. She looked confused, then nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly, in halting English. Doyle didn't answer. He just turned back to his stove. In the barracks, Greta began sweeping the floor before she was told. Marta helped patch a torn blanket. Lotte spent the morning repairing a loose latch on the door. No one asked them to. They simply did it. Not because they were grateful, but because something inside them had been realigned. It wasn't peace. It wasn't even friendliness. But it was a loosening, a softening of the ropes they'd all been pulling tight around themselves for too long. The guards noticed too. Some began leaving small things behind on accident, they would say if asked. A worn magazine, a candy wrapper with 2 pieces inside, a half-finished crossword puzzle. One even left a stub of a pencil on the windowsill. None of it was acknowledged aloud. To speak of it would be to name it, and to name it would be to admit that something had cracked open. And cracks were dangerous. The commandant kept his distance. Colonel Harrington watched from his porch, coffee cooling beside him, eyes following the rhythm of the camp. He said nothing to his officers, made no speeches, issued no warnings. He simply watched. Perhaps he understood better than most that mercy was not a policy, it was a contagion. And once it entered the bloodstream of a place, it spread without permission. Still, there were limits. There were still fences, still rules. The guards still held rifles. The women still wore the mark of the Reich on the sleeves of their prison-issued dresses. But underneath the surface, something had taken root. Something neither side could explain or erase. Not forgiveness, not even understanding. But the faint echo of a truth both had been taught to ignore. That the enemy was made of flesh and breath and memory too. And in that space between certainty and doubt, humanity stirred. Not loudly, not all at once, but like a lantern lit behind the eyes, flickering in the dark. The story was never meant to escape the wire. It was supposed to remain a footnote, a minor moment in a quiet corner of the war, buried beneath the weight of battles and death tolls and strategy maps. But someone talked. Maybe a guard wrote home and mentioned the pies. Maybe a cook, bitter and tired, let the word slip while drinking at a bar in town. However it happened, word reached Washington. And Washington did not like what it heard. A photo surfaced blurry, badly lit, but unmistakable. It showed German women seated at a table, eating from full plates, with an American flag hanging in the background. It reached a desk at the War Department, then another at the Senate. Letters followed. One from the mother of a soldier missing in the Ardennes, another from a congressman in Ohio. Why, one letter read, are we treating the enemy to turkey and oranges while our sons fight in the snow with tin rations and frozen boots? There was no answer. The military issued no statement. The photograph was quietly filed away. Internal memos passed between departments, requests for clarification, notes of concern. The term optics was not yet popular, but the sentiment was there. What would the American public say if they knew? That while their sons died in Belgium and their husbands starved in prisoner camps in Germany, captured enemy women were served whipped cream and pie. Behind closed doors, officials debated whether the Geneva Convention had been taken too far. Some suggested scaling back comfort provisions to access prisoners. Others insisted that American values must stand regardless of who sat across the table. But the matter was never truly settled, only buried. The orders remained on paper, unchanged, but a message rippled through the ranks. Be careful what stories get out. At Camp Hearn, the guards were called in for a quiet meeting. No reprimands, no shouting, just a reminder. Do your duty, the lieutenant said, but keep it to yourselves. After that, things went quiet again. The kitchen returned to routine. The women returned to chores. The memory of the feast hung in the air like smoke from a long dead fire, visible but fading. Doyle never mentioned the whipped cream again. The chaplain stopped his visits to the barracks. The oranges disappeared. There were no more gestures left on windowsills, not because they weren't allowed, but because kindness, once questioned, becomes dangerous. It had happened. They had fed the enemy. And it had unsettled something far bigger than a single camp. It had revealed that mercy, even when righteous, can look like betrayal to those who have lost too much. And so the story was buried, not erased, just buried deep enough that only those who lived it would remember. Far from the camp, in a modest home on the outskirts of Des Moines, a mother sat hunched at her kitchen table, the radio humming softly in the corner, its voice thin and distant like a ghost speaking from behind a curtain. Snow tapped against the window pane. Her fingers clutched a folded telegram with creases worn deep into the paper. It had arrived 3 days before Christmas. Her son, Private Thomas Leary, had gone missing during the German offensive in the Ardennes. The telegram said, "missing," but she knew what that meant. She had seen it in the eyes of the postman, in the way her husband had gripped the edge of the stove when he read the words. Missing meant cold. Missing meant alone. Missing meant gone. She hadn't eaten since. She had spent the holiday in silence, her tree unlit, the presents unopened. But then, on New Year's Day, her neighbor knocked with a copy of the local paper, eyes wide with outrage. "You've got to read this," she said. On the second page, beneath an article about war bonds, was a brief column. Enemy POWs in Texas receive Christmas feast. The words blurred. Roast turkey, mashed potatoes, pie, oranges, served to Germans, the enemy, and not just men, women, captured secretaries, typists. treated with kindness while her son lay beneath snow or worse. Something inside her snapped. She walked to the drawer, pulled out a pen and paper, and wrote with a fury that shook her hands. "To the War Department," it began. "My son froze in a forest because your army was too late. And while I sit here staring at his empty chair, you feed his killers pie. You give butter to those who wore the swastika. My boy got rations in a trench. They got whipped cream." Her handwriting grew jagged, the ink smudged by tears she didn't try to wipe away. "What kind of country rewards the enemy while burying its sons?" she wrote. "I hope they choked on it." She did not sign her name. She sealed it, stamped it, and sent it the next morning. The letter never reached Colonel Harrington. It was intercepted somewhere in Washington and filed away in a drawer already full of similar complaints. No one replied. But had the colonel read it, it might have broken him. Not because it was angry, but because it was right. The feast had been an act of principle, of duty, of something larger than war. But for mothers like her, principles were ashes, and no amount of decency fed to strangers could fill the empty chair at her table. By January, the sky above Camp Hearn returned to its usual colorless expanse, a pale dome stretched over rows of barracks, watchtowers, and wire. The holiday lights had been packed away, the mess hall stripped of any warmth that had once dared to linger. The chalkboard menus returned to the usual rations: powdered eggs, boiled beans, thin soups that left the mouth full of salt and regret. The women adjusted without complaint. They had learned long ago not to grow used to comfort, but the silence between them had changed, the kind of change that isn't spoken but felt, in glances, in shared moments, in the way someone might pass a crust of bread without being asked. They no longer flinched when a guard walked too near. They no longer feared that kindness meant weakness or that mercy was a trap. They knew better now. The feast had not ended the war, had not freed them, had not erased what they had seen or done. But it had fractured something, a belief, a certainty, that the world was divided neatly between sides, between guilt and innocence, justice and cruelty. The lines were no longer so clean. The guards felt it too. One morning, Private Aldridge, the same young man who had once called them witches in skirts, now nodded to Greta as she walked past on her way to the laundry room. It wasn't a smile, but it was no longer a scowl either. Another guard, tasked with escorting the women to the infirmary, offered a hand when Marta tripped on the icy steps. She hesitated, then took it. No words were spoken, and yet both understood what had just passed between them. The war beyond the fences raged on. Newspapers spoke of thousands lost in Belgium, of towns flattened, of concentration camps beginning to be uncovered in the east. But within the camp, the temperature held steady. No sudden bursts of violence, no new restrictions. The commandant issued no comment about the holiday meal. He had resumed his reports, his inspections, his coffee cooled beside him as before. But those who watched closely noticed he walked the perimeter more often now, hands behind his back, gaze distant, as if looking for something beyond the fence line. Perhaps it was a way forward. Perhaps it was penance. There were no more oranges, no more pie. No songs were sung, no prayers offered aloud. But in the stillness of that dry winter, the women carried on. The camp had not changed in structure. The war had not ended. But something inside each of them, guard and prisoner alike, had shifted just enough that they could no longer look at one another without remembering, not what was said, but what was done. And that, in its quiet way, was its own kind of revolution. Years passed, then decades. The war ended, borders redrawn, cities rebuilt, leaders buried. Time did what it always does. It softened the edges, dulled the noise, buried the dead beneath new names and new wars. But memory is a stubborn thing. In a quiet village near Freiburg, a woman named Marta sat by her window one winter morning, her lap covered in a patchwork quilt, her hands thinner now, more bone than skin. Her granddaughter sat across from her, eyes bright with the kind of questions children ask when they sense something unspoken. "You were in America?" the girl asked, voice full of disbelief. "As a prisoner?" Marta smiled gently. "Yes, a long time ago." She reached for a small box she kept tucked beneath the windowsill. Inside it, wrapped in yellowed tissue, was a napkin, faded, creased, but still intact. and tucked beside it, a folded scrap of paper, the edge of a Red Cross package, with words scrawled in pencil. They fed us pie, they let us pray, they did not call us enemy. Marta handed it to the girl. They gave us turkey, oranges, even whipped cream. The girl blinked. Why? Marta looked out the window then, past the snow, past the years. Because they were Americans, she said quietly. And they needed to remember who they were, even when the world wanted them to forget. The girl said nothing, but her hand stayed on the box, as if touching something sacred. In that moment, the past became more than a history lesson. It became a thread, woven through the quiet acts of people who chose not to hate, even when they had every reason to. Not all wars are won with bullets. Some are won in kitchens, in mess halls, in the trembling hands that pass a plate across enemy lines. And though no medal was ever given, no monument ever raised, the memory lived on in the hearts of those who survived. A single meal, a simple feast, offered not in surrender, but in defiance of cruelty, of vengeance, of the easy comfort of hate. Some stories are buried not because they are forgotten, but because they are too powerful to fit into the way history likes to be told. But we remember, because this, too, was war, and someone chose kindness. If this story moved you, share it. Let others remember what history tried to forget. Subscribe to WW2 Rations and Revelations for more untold truths hidden behind the wire.